that all persons held as slaves are and henceforward shall be free. These words first issued by President Abraham Lincoln this day 158 years ago. Joining us to reflect on the Emancipation Proclamation is Dr. Shannon Eves and Dr. Adam Dombey, assistant professors of history at the College of Charleston. I want to thank you both for joining us today. Dr. Eves, you specialize in 19th century U.S. history, African American history, and slavery and gender in the antebellum South. How would you hope America remembers and honors this day in history?
I would hope that, for me, my hope would be that Americans gain a real understanding of what the Emancipation Proclamation did and what it did not do. It's perhaps one of the most widely misunderstood documents in American history. And while it is significant in that the president, made a public declaration in freeing enslaved people, it actually did not free enslaved people in the way that many Americans understand. It was more so a military tool and a strategy that he used. And the document says that enslaved people were declared free in those states that were in rebellion against the Union. And it also made a promise that if those states were to return to the Union, they could keep their enslaved people. So this was an enticement not to issue widespread emancipation of slavery or to issue the total abolition of slavery, but to try to end the war quickly and to entice those states in rebellion against the Union to return.
Dr. Dombey, I want to bring you into this conversation. You're an award-winning Civil War historian. You're also the author of The False Cause, Fraud, Fabrication, and White Supremacy in Confederate Memory. Can you tell us a little bit about what this book is about?
Yeah, so the book looks at how we remember the war, specifically how white Southerners have remembered the Civil War and specifically forgotten certain aspects. When we talk about sort of the history of the war is one thing, but then there's the way that Americans like to think about the war. And so a classic example of this is the way that many Americans don't realize that the Civil War had everything to do with slavery, right? There's this myth that the slavery was not the cause of the war, when, let's be very clear, it was fundamentally the cause of the war. All you have to do is read the Articles of Secession for South Carolina, and you see each and every item that they're complaining about, which is really what the Articles of Secession are. They're a list of complaints, is to say this is how slavery is threatened, and that's how slavery is threatened, and this is why we're upset about slavery being threatened. And so the book looks at sort of how we remember the past specifically and how we commemorate the past, including how Confederate monuments played a role in this, and then how that distorted memory, I should say, was used to justify and uphold white supremacy and the Jim Crow segregation across the South during the early 20th century.
And you talk about four narratives in this book. Can you just briefly touch on which each narrative represents?
Yeah, so the lost cause narrative is a narrative that was upheld by white supremacists and largely by Southern whites in across the South. And it sort of celebrated Confederate soldiers as the greatest soldiers who ever lived, denied that slavery was the cause of the war. In contrast, there's another narrative that's held broadly across the South at the same time, and what we could call an emancipationist memory, if you will, is what David Blight calls it. It's a memory that African Americans across the South held about the war, that this was a war about freedom. This was a war that brought about the end of slavery. This was a war that should be celebrated. And then, of course, you have other memories of the war. For instance, in the North, you have a sort of a Union memory or a Unionist memory in the North that sort of celebrated a war which saved the Union and sort of focused on white Northern soldiers as heroic figures. And finally, you have a sort of lost memory that we don't talk about so much, a Southern Unionist memory for those that sort of held up by white Southerners who fought against the Confederacy, that celebrated the Union as well, and that the Confederacy was not all it was cracked up to be, that not all white Southerners supported it.
Well, I want to talk about, fast forward to current day, and to talk a little bit more about monuments and the tearing down of said monuments and how we move forward from where we once came. So we're going to take a break right here. When we come back, we're going to continue our conversation about the Emancipation Proclamation. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We've been chatting with Dr. Shannon Eves and Dr. Adam Dombey. They're assistant professors of history at the College of Charleston. We've been talking about today, 158 years ago, Abraham Lincoln, he first announced what we now know as the Emancipation Proclamation. You were just talking, Dr. Dombey, about monuments that have been erected as a memory to certain people who were aligned with our slavery past. But I want to talk a little bit further about that and why these particular symbols have become such a hot topic in recent memory. And Dr. Eves, this is a question for you. Why we're now just starting to talk about this? How come we didn't talk about this maybe 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 20 years ago?
Right. Well, the thing that's actually interesting is that, as Dr. Dombey mentioned, many of these Confederate monuments were not erected in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. Many of them were erected in the early 20th century, in the 19-teens and the 1920s, during the height of lynching in this country, during the height of disfranchisement of Black voters. And so they were very much, the people who erected them were very conscious of them being symbols of white supremacy and them being symbols of Jim Crow segregation. And even at the dedication of these monuments, they talk about very explicitly about how, the South needs to uphold, the white man's power over Black people. So the fact that they were symbols of white supremacy was no secret. And so you ask the question of, why are we just now talking about it now? But interesting enough, Black citizens were talking about how problematic these statues were when they were first erected. When we look at the Calhoun statue, one of the reasons why it had to be, put up so high in Marion Square is because it would be vandalized by Black citizens, in the early 20th century.
How do we go about having a civilized conversation? Because this gets very heated and people on both sides of the argument get very upset and feel that their voices aren't being heard. So how do we go about having a civilized conversation about this moving forward? And do you foresee any changes in the way young students in high school are learning about our history?
Yeah, that's a great question. How do we talk about this? How do we deal with these problematic big symbols? Because as Dr. Eves pointed out so aptly, these symbols were meant to celebrate in many ways the overturn of Reconstruction, the overturn of African-American rights that were given to them, and to sort of further that agenda. So these monuments are inherently connected to a white supremacist narrative of the past and white supremacist political movement when they went up. And they said that when they went up. Now, the trick is, if you want to have a civilized conversation about what to do with a set of monuments, is you first have to have a process. And right now, in the state of South Carolina, it is essentially, for all intents and purposes, illegal to remove any Confederate monument that's on public land. It's exceedingly hard. You have to have the state legislature pass a law for that individual monument. And not only that, but the law that protects it, the heritage law, went so far as to increase the normal standing for passage. They put in a clause that said 2/3 of the legislature has to support it, which is of questionable constitutionality to begin with.
So you don't see this as sanitizing history, but really it's taking down a symbol that shouldn't have been put up in the first place.
Well, let me speak to that directly, because I think this is really important. These monuments were meant to put forward a narrative of the past that was fundamentally ahistorical. And let's look at Charleston's own battery. Down at the battery, you have the Defenders of Fort Sumter Monument, which was put up to celebrate Confederate soldiers who defended the harbor from the United States. Why do we have a monument that celebrates, on the battery no less, where no shots were fired in anger, to celebrate Confederates who lost, I should mind you, Charleston citizens who lost the war, but we don't have one to those Charlestonians, those Black Charlestonians who were in the United States colored troops who freed the city from the Confederacy in 1865 and liberated all the enslaved people, which was a majority of the population of Charleston in 1865 was enslaved. And so we're not telling our full history if we have a monument that just celebrates one side of the conflict and a side that actually was fighting for slavery and that lost.
I appreciate your perspective, and I would hope to continue this conversation at some point in the future with you both.
Great. Thank you for having us.
Thank you. We're back after this.